The objective of the survey was to look at how Canadians see the issue of income inequality, whether there really are reasons to think, for example, that it will be an issue in future elections, how concerned ordinary Canadians are, what they see the reasons to be, and what they see as potential solutions, if any. And so that was sort of the context. We set up the survey so it would be a national survey, in the sense that we would have representative sampling from all of the regions of the country. The survey was done both in French and English. The Quebec sample is reliable and large. It allows for comparisons between the regions, between the provinces, but it also allows for comparisons on gender, party representation, age within households. We randomly selected, so we had a good representation within families. The context for the research is this broader social phenomena, the sort of bottom 99% perception that's emerged around the Occupy movements and all those, not just in Canada, but seen to be part of globalization and the impacts on inequality. And this specific survey really is to try to get a sort of ground-up perspective, to try to get an understanding of how ordinary Canadians see the issues, not how sort of Bay Street sees it or anything like that, and try to dig deeper from that perspective, try to identify the key observations that people have. One of the important findings, the large number of Canadians who perceive that the growing income gap is making Canada a less fair society. And for us, the underlying that question is how people see a fair society. What is a fair Canadian society? An important aspect that other research consistently shows is it's connected to the types of opportunities that are available to all Canadians. Is it a level playing field? Are there lots of opportunities for different people? And part of what the survey suggests is that, for example, declining number of good jobs is an indicator that lots of people perceive for themselves, and maybe even more so for their children, that they're going to have far fewer opportunities for social mobility. And that's a significant change in how Canada has seen itself. Again, it's interesting that people also did not see immigration as a core reason or fundamental reason. It's not that they thought there are lots of opportunities, but immigrants are taking those opportunities away, but rather that they actually perceived that in general there are far fewer opportunities. It fits neatly with some of the messages of the Occupy movement and the 99%, that the growth in opportunities that have occurred in the last 20 years have been at the very top. In general, Canadians think that the government can do things about it, that they can structure, make changes to the labor market, that, for example, you can read into it that improving access to, say, higher education might be the type of thing that flows from the perception that governments can do more or should be doing more. Again, though, there is an interesting gap between what people think the government can do and what they actually think the government is doing. In general, the survey shows clearly that people feel that the government is not doing enough. The numbers look worse for the federal government. I think most Canadians perceive that the federal government should be doing more and can do more. Provincial governments are making a difference, but a good example is our finding that close to 80% of Canadians think that raising the minimum wage could help. Experts have have doubts that, for example, the raising the minimum wage could reduce, serious poverty. But in a way, our survey is not just about poverty; it's about growing inequality among the middle classes. And to a certain extent, a lot of what the survey suggests is that the anxieties about the growing inequality are about middle-class Canadians and concerns about the futures for their children. Yes, and that is for sure. If people just had if we just found that people thought that there was a growing inequality, but didn't think it really mattered, that would be a very different implication. But again, to return that about 80% of Canadians say it's actually making Canada a less fair society, and in effect, less like the society that they want to live in, and again, what their children want to live in. There are some interesting regional differences. For example, between Ontario and Alberta. Predictably, in Alberta, there's much less concern about the disappearance of high-paying, good jobs. Ontario, that is a huge concern. There's a strong perception in Ontario that good jobs have declined in terms of presenting opportunities. If you dig down a bit deeper into the data too, you actually find that in Ottawa, Toronto, this is much less of a concern because those are areas where white-collar government jobs, for example, are still in reasonable supply, lots of banking, those kind of jobs. But in 905, 519 areas, you find much more anxiety about disappearance of these high-paying manufacturing jobs. Say, and you can imagine it maps onto declining number of jobs in the steel industry, auto supplies, the auto industry generally. And those haven't impacted Ottawa or Toronto per se, but they have impacted 905, 519 area. I think there are indications that gender did not play a big role, but age did present a role. For sure, lots of older Canadians who in a sense probably have a broader perspective about what it was like to have less of an income gap over their lifetime compared to now, are actually strongly identifying that the gap has grown much wider and that their perception is it's less fair. And again, part of the interesting thing is that although there are differences in party lines in the sense that people are NDP inclined see it as more of a problem, all three party affiliation groups see this growing income gap and see it as presenting a less fair society. One is, for example, I think it explains or fits well with why minimum wage increases are at the forefront of policy development. It's true, obviously, in Canada. Interestingly, of course, it's also true in the United States. That this is seen as one way to bring up the bottom, but the interesting implication is that we know that 12–13% of people collecting minimum wage rely on as their principal income. We know that a lot of the people collecting minimum wage are sort of 50–60% of them are actually students, people for whom that's a supplementary income within their households. But for middle-class families, that actually makes much more of a difference now than perhaps it did in the past. And raising the minimum wage for that group may not raise people out of poverty, but it will, if you want, help to stabilize incomes in middle-class groups and address some of those anxieties around. So that's one example. Again, the importance of of having a nimble job training development, which is pivotal right now in the federalism negotiations. The provinces and federal government trying to work that through, and why that's come to the forefront. Again, part of it is that thinking about the opportunities, especially for well-skilled people in the labor market who actually have to, if you want, pivot to other opportunities that you can imagine the economy offering. One of the interesting findings is that a very large number of Canadians do attribute the growing income gap to high compensation rates, dramatically increasing compensation rates at the very top. As is well known in both Europe and in the United States, there's actually been legislative attempts to rein in compensation at the very top. Canada has actually had none of that, and Canada arguably has seen some of the highest increased compensation rates at the very top. And so that's the type of thing that you can raise questions about whether that's an area of regulation. York is well known as being a leading Canadian university in this type of research. The issues, for example, about precarious work is a well-established area at York, which people again connect to some of the effects of globalization, the changing labor market, and we've begun to see legislation that's responded to that, government recognizing that that's an issue. That fits into some of the concerns about anxiety and security. Another area is York's well-established record in immigration, its social impact, economic opportunities for immigrants in Canadian society. Another area is questions about changing nature of the labor market and the effects of globalization on the labor market. Another issue is the role of income security measures. So if you think that, for example, one of the impacts on growing inequality may well be that pensions and the decline in public pensions, or sorry, if you want, in defined benefit pensions. Again, those are areas that, for example, at Schulich, they have unique national expertise in. So there's a sort of range of issues that it all fits broadly within a Canadian perspective. And again, the Institute for Social Research is the country's largest university-based survey research organization, and it has a specialty in doing election surveys and broader social research surveys.
We were interested in trying to understand what Canadians thought about the income gap, whether it had gotten worse, whether it stayed the same, whether there had been any kind of improvement, and how the distribution of income among Canadians had changed over the last 5 years. We did a survey of 1,900 Canadians. We surveyed people from the Atlantic provinces to British Columbia. We interviewed in English and French. All the interviewing was done from ISR. We talked to people for about 10 minutes on the telephone. Most of the interviews, about 90% of the interviews were done on landlines, and about 10% of them were done on cell phones. We do interviews in cell phones because some people now only have cell phones, and if we don't do interviews in cell phones, we might not have a representative sample. So we wanted to make sure we had a good representation of what Canadians thought. I think three things stood out for me. The first is that 75–80% of Canadians think the income gap has gotten bigger in the last 5 years. That's a big number. The second thing is that there was not a lot of variation. So people who are working, people who are not working, people from the East Coast, the West Coast, and in between, people who have lower incomes, people who have higher incomes, people with lower levels of education, higher levels of education, they all thought the income gap had gone up in the last 5 years. So there's a strong majority of Canadians of every stripe who think that the income gap has gone up. I think the third thing is that people who see the income gap as going up also think that this has made Canada a less fair society. So this kind of speaks to sort of the social fabric of the country and how this change in income distribution, an awful lot of people think this is a bad thing moving forward. To do a good survey, you got to work hard at it. We actually interview people over almost a 4-week time period. We interview people during the day, we interview people in the evening, we interview people on the weekend. When we called people and they said it was a really busy time, we asked them if it was a good time that we could call back. Some people who told us no early on in the survey, we called them again late in the survey to see if we get them to change their mind. So we work hard to get a good representation of people to talk to us. The other thing that we do is when we call a household, we don't just interview whoever answers the phone. We sort of randomly select someone in the household. So we randomly select telephone numbers, randomly select people in the household. No substitutions are made. We're trying to get a good sample so when we say this is what Canadians think, we can be pretty confident in what we find. Well, there's two things that we look at. The first thing is we're concerned about the size of the sample. Larger samples are better than small samples. With the sample that we have for Canada-wide estimates, our error rate is 2.2%, which is really quite low. The second thing is we want to look at the way the data goes together. So for example, if we found that people with low incomes thought the gap was disappearing, and people with high incomes thought the gap was getting large, that intuitively would not be very sensible. So when we look at the data, there's a lot of what we would call face validity. So we find, for example, conservatives are less likely to think the gap has grown. We find that people who are NDP supporters are most likely to think the gap has grown. So there's a lot of suggestions in the data that things hang together in a way that makes sense based upon our understanding of other phenomena.